Hi, everyone. Excited to have you on this call today. We will give a few seconds for everyone to join, but thank you so much for joining us today to talk a little bit about the true cost of hiring when it comes to both permanent placement and contract to hire. Excited to dig into it with you, with Keith and I. A little bit about Insight Global to begin. We are full service staffing services company. So global company, we have about 65, 70 offices in North America alone, as well as a global presence. Really, in terms of history and who we are, we've been around for 20 years. We offer anything from contract to hire and permanent placement, as well as professional services, DE&I consulting, really a myriad of different things. So encourage you to check out our website if you're interested in learning more. We will also have a Q&A for this call at the end. So would love for you to put your questions in the chat, and Keith and I will get to them as soon as we're done going through the material for you today. Moving forward, to introduce ourselves prior to talking about the true cost of hiring and really what goes into a permanent placement and what goes into a contract hire, I want to introduce ourselves today. My name is Rebecca Farno. I'm a consultant engagement lead over the digital office. So we're a dispersed office across the US, and I both recruit, sell, and oversee retention strategy for our consultants. I've been in the recruiting and marketing space for about 7 years now, with Insight Global for about 4, and really excited to talk to y'all today. And I'll turn it to Keith to introduce himself.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Reb. My name's Keith Simpson. I actually sit out of our Boston office. I've been with Insight Global for about 6 years now, and that's been my entire time in the recruiting field. But I've held a couple different roles here at Insight Global, some more candidate facing, some more client facing. The role I'm in right now as a lead hiring partner is a combination of both. So I feel like a true subject matter expert when it comes to the true cost of hiring.
Awesome. Cool. So we will dig into it prior. I just want to give a heads up. Keith and I are both offering one-on-one consultations. We're hiring partners in addition to our management functions. So if you have any questions about hiring needs that you might have, what it might cost you to hire, interest in potentially engaging an agency, we'll drop our meetings link both in the chat and in a follow-up email. So y'all are welcome to directly schedule time with us. We would love to connect with you. So that being said, our links were just dropped in the audience chat if you want to check them out, but we will go ahead and get started. So what we're covering today is really an overview of what it costs to hire an employee. So of course we think of salary, but what else? What goes into actually managing that employee and onboarding them and all of that? In addition, we consider those hard costs, right? And then we want to think about the soft costs, so things that are harder to articulate in a numerical form. Anything ranging from time to opportunity to attrition to all these different things that really compile and make hiring expensive or cost efficient. So we'll get into that. And then thereafter, we want to talk about, okay, so we've identified issues and identified reasons why maybe hiring is a bit more expensive than it should be. How can we take measures to reduce those costs of hiring, both in the contract situation and in the permanent situation? So excited to give some prescriptions to you guys. So that being said, I will turn it over to Keith to kick us off.
Yeah. And thanks, Rob. We'll start with like the true cost of hiring and what goes into hiring. Here is like more of a permanent employee. And everyone always thinks about like the salary, but I feel like that's where a lot of people stop, is just the salary. But we also need to take into consideration that the company itself is going to pay for benefits. It's going to pay for taxes, the additional costs to onboard this employee, to actually recruit and source for this employee. There are multiple different factors that go into that we'll get into in a little bit later. And then obviously soft costs, which we'll get into as well, like interview times, the lost productivity when you're actually needing to source resumes and interview those candidates that you're not spending dedicated to your actual day job. And something that we found from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's anywhere from an additional 40 to 60% on top of somebody's salary that the company is actually going to be paying for a permanent employee. And so we'll get into some examples a little bit further, but something else to note here is that in the job market alone and in the workforce, about 30% of candidates actually leave their role that they just started within 90 days. So we need to take that into consideration in the true cost as well, because you're going to be spending a lot more time and effort and money if you don't get that hire right in the first place. And so that's kind of a brief overview of the true cost of hiring. And when we go to the next slide, we'll kind of dive into an actual example for you guys. And I like easy math here. So we just created an employee that's making $100,000. What we need to take into consideration, is that 30% is going to be based on taxes. 11% of benefits is added to that cost. 3% of like liability, workers' comp, just in case anything like that happens. 1% of administrative costs. So all of that. And then you need to take into consideration like the $5,000. We noticed that of the research we did, it's right around $5,000 for additional hiring costs, which what goes into that is the factors of how you find this candidate. Are you paying somebody to post on job boards? Do you guys have multiple job board subscriptions, etc.? So these things can add up, and it comes out to about $5,000 per hire. And then we need to think about like the training that they go through, the onboarding, maybe their equipment, maybe it's sending them equipment if they're a remote employee, etc. And so this one came out to about 50% of their total compensation added on to actually hiring this employee. So the company in the first year would actually pay $150,000 out of their pocket, even though only 100K is going to that employee. So that's something that we need to take into consideration when we think about how much is it going to cost me to hire X individual.
Totally. Yeah. And I look at this and I think about, hiring costs, $5,000 for hiring costs on average. Think about how expensive job board subscriptions are, how expensive software subscriptions are for an applicant tracking system or an HR management software or anything like that. Really goes into the actual cost of hiring if you think about it on the back end, because you need that infrastructure to be able to identify those candidates. So $5,000 from my perspective is a bit conservative as well with how expensive those kinds of things can be these days. As well, I think there's so many other fringe costs that we don't necessarily think about. For example, I have a friend in the legal field, and their company has a structure where for a referral program, if you refer an individual and they get hired, you get a $25,000 bonus. That's a lot, of course, but you think about it's paid on their day one and on their month 6. So that's $12,500 right out the gate the second they start. And you think about what other referral bonuses happen in practice. I've heard of a lot. $25,000 is a bit more, but I've seen, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 afforded to folks that refer candidates to the company's way. So there's a lot of other fringe benefits or fringe costs, to think about when we're anticipating the true cost of hiring. But rule of thumb, as Keith said, for 100K, you're looking at 140 to 160. Typically, it's anywhere from 40 to 60% more based off data we've pulled from Bureau of Labor Statistics and different HR sources. So that being said, these are very clear, cut and dry, hard costs of what a hiring a permanent employee costs, related to taxes and benefits, liabilities, all that. But as I mentioned in the intro, there's a lot of soft costs that we want to evaluate too. And these are kind of a little bit more nuanced. Take some time to really understand and articulate what that can cost for an individual organization. So would encourage y'all to think of that from your company's perspective of how maybe these soft costs could be affecting your hiring processes and the cost of those hiring processes. So first, I think about time to hire and how that could be a nuanced soft cost related to hiring. So the average time to hire an employee across industries is 6 to 9 weeks. For Insight Global, it's about 2 to 4 weeks, so a bit faster, but 6 to 9 weeks of the whole process of identifying the candidate, of course, engaging with the candidate, doing the interview process, doing offer negotiation, doing onboarding. Onboarding doesn't even count within the 6 to 9 weeks. So if you think about the length of time that it actually takes to invest a manager's time, and HR points of contact time, a bunch of different people's time to hire one individual, that's a lot of time that could be spent working towards KPIs, that could be working towards a project that is being dedicated to interviewing and going through the process. Especially when you think about higher level roles, these interview processes can be 6-8 hours long in total, and that's a lot of work for somebody to do and interview multiple candidates through the process, especially elongating 6 to 9 weeks. That's a couple hours every week that could be used spent in productivity or people management or something like that.
And I think a good point to note here, right, is that average time, 6 to 9 weeks, is a long time to keep a candidate in the loop too. So you got to think about the time and effort it takes to keep a candidate interested in that opportunity for the duration of that interview process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point.
And then we can kind of talk about like what happens if you don't get it right the first time, right? Then there are going to be added costs that way as well. And we mentioned a little bit earlier that 30% of candidates leave their role within the first 90 days of starting. So I know Reb mentioned that she has a client and a friend that's willing to offer a $25,000 referral bonus. It just goes to show how important it is to get it right the first time, right? They're relying really heavily on referrals and they know that that person's going to work out. But you have to think about the soft costs that go into it when that person doesn't work out, right? You spend a lot of time and effort on onboarding this person, introducing them to their team, getting them ramped up to speed. And if they then leave after the first 30, 60, 90 days, then all of that is kind of for nothing, right? So that's what I think about when I think of when you don't get it right the first time. Think about the money that you spent to hire this person too, right? Like we can go back to the hard costs, that $5,000 of the job boards that you're spending. Now you're spending that again for an additional candidate, right? And so you paid this person benefits, you paid them taxes, all of that for, let's say they were on site for 30 or 60 days, you're still paying that. And so you need to hire another person to actually fill this position and get it right this time. So if you're not able to get that hire right the first time, those costs just exponentially increase. And so we see a lot of times that people want to make sure that they get hires right the first time. And something that I would just say is like, why not utilize an agency that is a subject matter expert on hiring that can take over all of that for you and has the ability to retain that top talent too.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, the 30% stat is wild to me. You think about all the effort you put in, and a third of your effort is going to be lost within the first 90 days. Insight Global, I mean, we've recognized that to be such a loss of revenue opportunity that we've invested in an entire division. It's called our consultant engagement division, but entire division focused on retaining folk. To make sure that these costs, one, of course, we want to provide the best service that we can to our consultants and the folks that we place on site for our clients. But in addition to that, we want to make sure that we're not wasting people's time. We're not wasting our clients' time. We're not wasting, key time to hit KPIs. And we've invested heavily in this division to lessen that 30% down to 10% personally from Insight Global. But so to say, from the bigger picture, like we have made such a large investment because we recognize how much of a revenue loss attrition and bad hires can be. So I really think that that's something to consider as you attendees are thinking about our hiring processes, right? Like what maybe understanding what are your attrition rates? Like how often are people actually leaving your company in the first 6 months? Are those specific to teams? Like where can you start to think about that kind of landscape? I feel like is a really helpful exercise to start stepping in the right direction.
Absolutely. And then we can go into like reducing the costs of hiring. And how are we able to do that, right? There's a couple different avenues that we're going to go through, and we can talk a little bit more about it. The first one we would talk about is contract to hire. What if you guys didn't have to commit to those upfront costs right away? You can utilize an agency that's going to take on all of that for you, right? An agency provides the recruiting services. They interview these candidates. They'll provide these candidates references for you. They do the entire onboarding process, even throughout the onboarding paperwork, just to make sure that they get ramped up to speed. And agencies, most of them, not all of them, but will cover benefits. Here at Insight Global, we would provide benefits for our consultants. And it's just that end-to-end recruiting process that you are getting from that contract to hire model. And so that's a way to reduce like that upfront cost of a lump sum, right? Where you're not paying that right away. You're paying it over a course of 7, 10, 30 days. And so it's not that lump sum. It might seem a little bit more feasible to pay it in equal installments for that matter. What I would say here is something we like to say all the time at Insight Global is like test before you invest, right? Everyone wants to know that their investment's going to pay off. And when you are able to hire a direct hire and they're going to leave, 30% of them are going to leave within the first 90 days. Why not utilize an agency that can do contract to hire for you? And that way, as Reb mentioned, we have this Engage program that we know that we're going to retain that talent and we're going to make sure that they're going to stay on site for after those 90 days, not just those first 90 days. So making sure that your investment is actually paying off, and contract to hire is a great way to do that. I think another thing to mention is everyone thinks about like the time, right? Agencies normally can come through a little bit quicker. They have all of the subscriptions to these job boards, and they're able to produce candidates a little bit faster and more efficiently. And so I always like to say, like, time is money, right? Time is money saved. So you guys are able to work on those KPIs, the actual projects that you need to do at your company, and leave it to like an expert of the hiring field to come through for these candidates with you.
I think it's a good point to think about that too, because at least my pulse, I've both worked at an agency and used agencies to hire before. And my pulse, in the past, is so many folk think about it as like, oh, well, we can recruit ourselves. We can do it ourselves. Like we can post a job and we can wait. To your point, time is money. But also I think about it as the full process outsourcing. Like what I mentioned about understanding what are your attrition rates, what are your retention efforts, what's your team by team attrition, what's your typical employee sentiment, do you have an employee NPS, do you have those kinds of structures in place. A lot of times to really optimize the recruiting strategy, it can be a longer term lift, maybe not a heavy lift, but there's processes you have to put in place, there's time that's required, there's optimization that's required. And where agencies and the contract to hire model really wins is when you don't necessarily have the time or the bandwidth to optimize that, because we have a full optimized outsourced recruiting strategy where we work as a consultant to you to make sure that obviously everything you need is met. But I think about it when you're evaluating, okay, can we do this ourselves or does it make sense to engage a third party? It's all about the process. Like, do you feel really strong in your process, like you're doing everything right? And if not, I think that that's a really good opportunity to explore, okay, maybe we need some third party help.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point too.
Yeah. And with that, I mean, I've kind of professed this a lot, but streamlining your recruiting process is the most important thing that you can do to save money with hiring. This slide is like my Roman Empire, if you will. So streamlining, like I said, there's ways to streamline externally. So outsourced recruiting partnerships, Insight Global being one of them, different kinds of agencies, but also if you're really working on a shoestring budget, you don't have the approval to work with outside vendors and you're just looking at yourself and your company. I like to think about it in three ways of how you can streamline it. There were three sections of the recruiting process, I guess. So before you're talking to a candidate, while the candidate's engaged, and then the onboarding and start process. So when you think about where folks are before you get a hold of them, where are your roles posted and sourced? How is your job description written? Do you have specific target audiences and past companies that you want to reach for? Like, do you have your ideal candidate profile that you want to leverage while you're recruiting? Do you have that zero, or I guess, pin straight focus? In addition, of course, when you're engaging with the actual candidate, think about, okay, how can this interview process go from 6 to 9 weeks to 2 to 4 weeks, right? How can we save time and save money through outlining, okay, we're going to have interviews on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of next week. We're going to book the director's calendar for these 2 hours, the senior director's calendars for these 2 hours, and we're going to optimize it in a way that we know the exact interview path once we identify the candidate. That's a huge way to streamline the process, make everything go faster. One, everybody's held accountable. It's on their calendars. Everybody knows it's coming. And two, you can predict the process a little bit better. So you can also, from a budgetary perspective, predict the time investment that's going to be required to find this individual. And then after all that's said and done, all the negotiation offers accepted, how do you have the tightest onboarding process possible? Are you making sure they get all of their equipment as soon as possible? Do you have all the background check and that kind of stuff streamlined in a way that you're not finding out 2 days before start that maybe their background check isn't done, or there's something holding up the efficiency of the process? Is really looking at it point by point by point, and understanding where you can increase efficiency. And I think to conclude, all of that stems from being able to effectively source and find candidates quickly, because that whole interview process is hinged on your ability to identify the top talent. And I think that that's another point of inflection to really think about: do we have the resources we need to identify that quickly and put them in the process to make this process 2 to 4 weeks and save money?
Absolutely. And Reb, I think looking at it from a different lens too, right? Like look at it from the candidate side. They want a streamlined interview process. You might lose out on top talent if your interview process and screening process isn't streamlined. There a lot of times they're going to take that first offer that comes to them because, as let's face it, like we're in a tough situation here, and jobs are hard to come by for some people, and so a lot of people are looking for work, and they're just looking to get that first role that comes to them. So if you're able to streamline that process, it's going to better your chances for actually finding that top talent and retaining that top talent.
Totally. Um, And then as well, in addition to that, I think, Keith, you've always done a really good job of this, of coaching how to really like write a job description that's actually achievable. I think that's such a huge part.
Yeah, and that's such a great point too, right? I think a lot of people look at job descriptions and actually read job descriptions to make sure that they're going to be a good fit for that role before they apply. But there's also the other side of the spectrum where people just shoot off their resume hoping to get a hit, and so it's important to evaluate skill sets and actually train people on how to write job descriptions, right? Like when we look at certain positions that people give to us, we're now looking at them and we're like, okay, they're looking for somebody to have 10 to 15 of these qualifications. That might not exist. So we're going to be that person that you can come to and almost have like a consultation with. And we'll let you know, okay, hey, that's probably not feasible right now in this market, especially let's say you're looking for somebody to sit on site in a certain location, right? If we were to open it up to a remote aspect, more candidates are going to be interested right now, and more candidates will pop up in the search just due to volume of numbers. And then one thing I like to think about is a lot of people are so set on, okay, I need this person to have all 10 of those qualifications. But if somebody that has 8 of them, are they going to do just as well in an interview and in the actual job if they're missing one or two little things that they might be able to be coached on or they are willing to learn, right? That's something that goes into that interview process and that streamlined process as well, is just making sure that this person has the go-getter mentality that you might be looking for, that's willing to learn and wants to learn. And so I think people, when they're hiring, will focus too much on a resume and it might not have everything, and they'll miss out on quality candidates due to that. So it's easy to consult a staffing agency, and they can help you write a job description or even help you like condense your job description and make it profound. I think that's really important to attracting the right talent as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think about right person versus right skill set. If it's most of the way on paper, it's still worth the conversation. Because I think about some of the best employees I've ever had. They're, like you said, they have the go-getter mentality and they're focused on learning, but maybe they don't have that perfect recruiting experience or perfect marketing experience. I think about one time, I was working with a client, and it was on a tougher position. It was a technical position, and they wanted somebody with 4 years of experience in a JavaScript technical library that had only existed for 5 years. And thinking, okay, like let's think about the realistic nature of being able to identify somebody that's been with this technology since the beginning. Probably a little bit unlikely. So after we took a pulse in the market, understood really what our landscape looked like, is we were able to lessen that skill set requirements from the 10 out of 10 to the 8 out of 10. And then we were able to find somebody like that. And they were trained up, ended up converting to permanent. It went great, right? So I think it's just almost the self-reflection of, okay, what am I realistically within my bandwidth as a hiring manager? What am I willing to train on? and what do I just not have the bandwidth to train on? And if you really think about it, like, you could say you lessen your interview process from 9 weeks to 4 weeks. You could spend those 5 weeks training your individual to be exactly what you wanted them to be for the longer interview process, and find the right person with the right, I guess, soft skills for your company. So to say, I to keep to your point, I think, being able to look inward and identify what the key true skill sets are versus all the fluff that would be nice is an important way to get your candidates fast.
Yeah, and I think something to add on that too, right? Like if this person doesn't have all the qualifications, they might not be looking for that top level salary requirement as well. So that could be an additional way to reduce hiring costs.
Such a good point. I didn't even think of that. Yeah, cool. Well, I think that there's a lot of different things that we can take from today in terms of understanding what really goes into the permanent nature of hiring, the contract nature of hiring, how we can improve upon that in terms of efficiency and cost efficiency. So, like we discussed, hiring a permanent employee is not just the salary. It can be anywhere from 40 to 60%, and potentially even more in certain extenuating circumstances over the first year to hire a permanent employee. The hidden costs are something that aren't always on paper, but it's something you really need to evaluate when you're thinking budgetarily and working with your HR team to figure out, what salary bands, what's really going to be realistic. Um, that kind of goes in tandem with the hard costs and the soft costs that we talked about. And then being able to look at both and address that there are ways to reduce risks with external partnerships. So, like we said, with staffing vendors, Insight Global, and the like, being able to outsource that recruiting process, understanding and having faith that it's fully optimized, because that's our job, to optimize those processes for you, as well as having an understanding of the pulse of the market and using that consultative nature to make sure your positions and your hiring process is as tight as possible, and we're finding the best candidates and retaining them for you. Lastly, cost reduction is certainly achievable by optimizing your internal processes. Like I mentioned, optimizing the process before you talk to the candidate, while you're engaging with the candidate, and then while you're onboarding that hire. Those are the three buckets that I really look at when I talk about optimizing an interview process or a hiring process for clients. So I hope y'all got some good nuggets from today. Keith and I are in the weeds, both with clients and from managing our folk in our digital office. So we've seen a lot in the market, and hopefully, this was helpful. But I want to open it up to everybody else to answer some questions. I would love to hear from the audience.
Yeah. Reb, I actually saw one question come in, and it was how does contract to hire actually reduce costs? So I can take that one. I think what we need to think about here is like, what is those true costs to hire before we actually hire this person, right? I think it's more of the sourcing, finding candidates, the time value of money where it's interviewing these candidates as well, right? An agency is going to do all of that for you. And that's going to be that contract to hire model where you're not paying this agency up front. There are some agencies that work off of a retainer. Most of them out there that you will find will offer like a free recruiting service, and you only pay them until you start paying the candidate as well. So that's something that like Insight Global will do. That entire recruiting process is free. And then once that person starts, that's when you'll get that first bill, so to speak. So it reduces that large upfront cost, that lump sum that could be pretty scary and hefty for certain roles. So I think that's the way you need to think about it when you're asking, okay, does contract to hire actually reduce costs? It reduces those upfront costs and gives you more time and effort back into your day to complete your day job, hit those KPIs. That time isn't wasted on interviewing, sourcing, etc.
Yeah, and then you could also leverage that contract to hire model, leverage the agency you're working with to make sure that your people are being retained, structured performance reviews, all of that, just to really make sure that once we identify that talent, we're keeping that talent, and we're not dealing with bad hires, we're not dealing with attrition, because we're working with a fully optimized recruiting process and post-hire process. I also see, it's like Patrick asked, what if I'm a small business and don't have a recruiting process? How can I make that more efficient? It's a great question. First, I have to say, engage a staffing vendor. But if you don't want to do that, or if you're looking to really work on a shoestring budget or optimize what you already have, I think you can leverage free tools. So I will say LinkedIn has one free job post that you can use associated with your personal account, for example. That's maybe something you can use to make it more efficient. But at the end of the day, I really think if it's just you recruiting, think about how much time you truly have to dedicate a week. So say you're running a business, you have a lot going on, you only have 2 hours a week. Okay, so let's work on for that 1 hour a week, let's work on sourcing that individuals, those candidates. And that could be done through your personal network. That can be done by those free job posts that I mentioned. That can be done by a multitude of different ways, asking old employees that you've had, hey, do you have any referrals or anything like that? But then also really making sure that spending that other hour, making sure that your job description is something that's going to be really attractive to folks. So attractive compensation, attractive responsibilities, opportunity for growth. And then from there, making sure that everything in that standpoint is in lockstep with what your actual expectations are. So, like Keith and I were talking about, evaluating the skill sets. But beyond all that, I think the way you can be most efficient is once you identify that person, keep them in the loop as respectfully and aggressively as you can. There are a lot of people that are lost in the interview process because they don't hear from a hiring manager for 2 weeks, and then they accept another job, and then a hiring manager starting from square one, right? So I think it's really cherishing and respecting the candidates that you are able to identify, and then walking them through that process and walking through it with them together, I think is important.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing you said there is like cherishing that candidate, right? Making sure that you're providing a great experience for them throughout that interview process, because it's only going to bolster their experience with the company. If the recruiting process is seamless, then they're going to be more excited to join that company than a company that doesn't reach out to them for 2 weeks. And then it's like, okay, hey, now we want an interview. So I think that's such a good point to note too.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mahi, I see your notes. We would love to help you out. We do have our meetings link in the chat just above, but in addition, we can reach out to you after and we can have a conversation around how we can best support you for your hiring needs. Um, Outside of that, I think those are all the questions. Those are all the questions we see. So I really wanted to sincerely thank all of you for your time joining us, talking through the cost of hiring. I know it can be nuanced and a little confusing, and a lot of folks don't think about what it actually costs to hire an employee. So really thankful that y'all walk through this with us, and we're looking forward to seeing you in our next event.
Thanks, guys.